The Nuremberg trials, 1945. If Hess is really insane, how can he be tried with his old Nazi colleagues as a war criminal? Confronted with Goering, his former secretaries, some of his oldest friends, most believe him mad. 7 psychiatrists, however, American, British, French, and Russian, conclude Hess has recovered from a true psychotic episode induced by the ignominious failure of his mission. He is unstable, and he has, doctors say, a culturally conditioned pseudo-paranoia, but is legally sane and can be tried. However, the War Crimes Tribunal must decide if Hess's loss of memory will hinder his ability to defend himself. A chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, Telford Taylor.
One of the other lawyers on the staff assisting Justice Jackson was the late John Harlan Amon, a prominent New York attorney. Amon got the idea that he would collect a lot of documentary movies of the Nazi period, movies which showed Hess himself, showed him with Hitler, showed him addressing great party rallies, showed him in all kinds of different situations in the period before he flew to England. And he would bring in Hess with a lot of people, a lot of witnesses there, and sit Hess down and show him these movies and see if that did anything to restore Hess's memory. Well, I'm afraid it didn't work very well. These movies were very interesting, and Hess watched them with great interest, and at the end of them, John Harlan Amon said to him, "Well, Hess, do you remember anything?" Hess said no. That was that.
Associate Prosecutor William Baldwin, who prosecuted the case against defendant Hans Frank, was an assistant to Colonel John Amon and was very much involved in the Rudolf Hess interrogation.
One of the things that I can't give you, although you can look at it, was the interrogation of Hess with these other guys. What's your full name? Rudolf Hess. I sat in on this because I was interested in it. This is after he was brought back. Your name is Rudolf Hess, yes. You look to the right of this gentleman. At him, pointing to Goering. Yes. Don't you know me, Goering says. Who are you? You ought to know, we've been together for years. That must have been at the same time as the book that was submitted to me this morning. I've lost my memory for some time. It's terrible. Don't you know me? You don't recognize me? Goering was furious. No, but we talked a lot together. Not personally, but I remember your name. We were together. They were both in the Richthofen squadron. Listen, Hess, I was the Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe. You flew to England in one of my planes. Don't you remember I was the Supreme Commander? First I was a Field Marshal and later a Reich Marshal. Don't you remember? Hess, no. Don't you remember I was made a Reich Marshal at the meeting of the Reichstag when you were present? Don't you remember that? Yes, no. Don't you remember that the Fuhrer at the meeting of the Reichstag announced in the Reichstag that if something happened to him, that I would be his successor? If something happened to me, you were to be my successor? Don't you remember that? No. You don't remember that? We two discussed that very long afterwards. Yes, this is terrible. The doctors, blah, blah, blah.
And you were there.
Yeah.
The head of the United States Army Interrogation Unit at Nuremberg was Richard W. Sonnenfeld. We had a chance to interview Mr. Sonnenfeld in December of 2003. And he was in the middle of that interrogation. Received this transcript from Bill Baldwin, one of the prosecutors for Justice Jackson, who was a second and below Colonel Amon. And Bill Baldwin, when I interviewed him in New Hampshire, I asked him, I said, "Is there anything I should be asking you?" And he pulled out of his drawer a transcript, and he started reading it. And he just was very engaging. Listen to this, listen to this, listen to Colonel Amon said, listen to this. And then he said, when he got done, I said, would you like a copy of it? And I said, yes, I would. So he gave it to me. And I'm going to give it to you. And I know this brings back memories of...
I mean, just to look at.
That brings back some memories.
Oh, sure. Well, I tell you, it's one of the... this is one of the scenes that I describe in my book.
Right.
Well, you know, Rudolf Hess once was the principal deputy of Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there was always some confusion. He was the principal deputy of Hitler for the leadership of the party. He was never really the principal deputy as head of state. Goering became that later, but Hess, you know, as you know, stole, absconded with an airplane to England. I mean, you know the whole story, trying to persuade the British to make a separate peace so that Hitler could attack the Soviet Union with nobody else to worry about. And in England, he then exhibited some strange symptoms. I mean, he started hoarding food samples because he believed his British captors were trying to poison him, and he certainly behaved irrationally. At any rate, at the end of the war, he was a prisoner in Britain, and he was brought to Nuremberg. And when he arrived at Nuremberg, and I can't remember now whether that was the first time that he did this, but at Nuremberg from the very beginning, he claimed to have amnesia. Mm-hmm. And because he had amnesia, and by the way, he was an unindicted material witness like all of the other defendants. I mean, when I first met them, you know, in July and August, they weren't indicted until October the 20th, and our job was basically to find out who should be indicted and for what. Because in general, we knew what had happened, but we didn't know who had done what. So at any rate, Hess was an unindicted material witness who pretended to have total amnesia. We've been together for years. Well, that must have been the same time, said Hess, as the book that was submitted. Goering, don't you know me? Not personally, but I remember your name, says Hess. And now, Goering, but we talked a lot together. Let me see whether I can find the part where he bragged about how important he was and how crushed he was that even his august titles didn't get. Yeah, here's Goering. You see, I told you. Listen, Hess, I was the Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe, and you flew to England in one of my planes. Don't you remember that I was the Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe? First, I was a Field Marshal, and later a Reichsmarshal. Don't you remember? And I remember Hess staring at him and saying, no. Don't you remember that I was made a Reichsmarshal at a meeting of the Reichstag? So on and so forth. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can tell my memory of the occasion was reasonably accurate, but I have to tell you, he was Haushofer, and I'd have to look at this to see whether it's reflected in here. Haushofer broke out in tears when Hess, who had been his protege, and whom he'd regarded as a son. By the way, before that, we had Hess meet with his secretaries, who ran shrieking and weeping from the room because their idealized boss, Hess, didn't recognize him. Well, Haushofer wept